In 1971, the Robertson family walked away from ordinary life and set sail toward the unknown. Their goal was simple in words, but enormous in scale: to sail around the world. At first, it felt like a dream. Open waters, distant shores, a family bound together by adventure. But in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that dream would turn into a nightmare when their boat was attacked by killer whales. From that moment on, the voyage was no longer about exploration. It was about survival. To stay alive, the family would have to remain united and endure conditions that pushed the limits of human strength and resilience. The question was no longer how far they could travel, but whether their determination would be enough to save them. The story begins decades earlier with Douglas Robertson. A naval officer during World War II, Douglas experienced unimaginable loss in 1942. While stationed in Sri Lanka, a Japanese attack on the vessel Essex Saigon claimed the lives of his wife and young son. The tragedy shattered him. He left the sea behind. Years later, he remarried. He wed Linda Poi and purchased a farm in England, determined to build a quiet, stable life away from the ocean that had brought him so much pain. But the sea never truly left him. For nearly 20 years, Douglas tried to settle into the rhythm of farm life. Days became predictable. The most significant event was the arrival of the milk truck that collected the cow's milk for delivery to Manchester. The routine was safe, but painfully monotonous. Inside him, something remained restless. Eventually, that restlessness took shape as a bold idea: to buy a boat and sail around the world with his children. Not to read about distant places in schoolbooks, but to experience them firsthand. To feel the wind, smell the salt air, and confront the world in all its beauty and hardship. At the time, the children were growing up quickly. And was 18. Douglas Jr. was 16. And the 9-year-old twins, Neil and Sandy, were full of curiosity. According to the family, it all truly began one day when young Neil innocently asked, "Dad, you're a sailor. Why don't we sail around the world?" That simple question changed everything. The family sold their farm and, in Malta, purchased a 50-year-old schooner named Lucette. On January 27, 1971, the Robertson family departed from the port of Falmouth in England, setting off on what they believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. In truth, the journey was poorly planned from the start. Douglas had extensive maritime experience, and his daughter, and had learned some basic skills during the return trip from Malta. But the rest of the family had no sailing experience at all. They had never even taken a short trial voyage together, and their equipment was far from sufficient for a journey of this magnitude. Yet, despite the risks and the lack of preparation, their first year at sea was extraordinary. From England they sailed to Portugal, then on to the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, the Bahamas, and finally Miami. To finance the next stage of their journey, the family spent nearly 6 months in Miami working and saving money. When they were ready, they passed through the Panama Canal and reached the Galapagos Islands. It was there that their daughter Anne made the difficult decision to leave the voyage. In her place, a university student named Robin Williams joined the crew. Ahead of them lay the greatest challenge yet: the Pacific Ocean, a vast expanse covering nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface, scattered with more than 20,000 islands. On June 13, 1972, they departed from the Galapagos, heading west toward the Marquesas Islands. The crossing was expected to take about 40 days. On the second morning at sea, they noticed several large dark shapes on the horizon. At first, they assumed it was a typical pod of whales. But something was different. The animals were moving closer than normal. Faster. More aggressively. It was a pod of killer whales. Under ordinary circumstances, whales are not considered a direct threat to humans. But when group behavior becomes unpredictable, even a sturdy vessel can be at risk. Suddenly, one of the largest whales rammed the underside of the boat with tremendous force. The impact shook the vessel violently. The wooden hull groaned and cracked. Then came a second blow. And a third. The aging boat could not withstand the assault. The hull was breached. Water began rushing in. There was no time to send a distress signal. Recognizing the severity of the situation, Douglas ordered everyone to abandon ship. They had only two means of survival: a life raft gifted to them at the beginning of their journey by an Icelandic family they had befriended, and a small dinghy named Edna May. Their son Douglas lowered both into the sea and tied them together. Grabbing whatever supplies they could carry, the family climbed aboard the raft. Minutes later, they heard a violent cracking sound. The boat that had been their home for years, the vessel that carried their dreams, disappeared beneath the surface of the Pacific. In an instant, their dream of sailing around the world became a fight to stay alive. It did not take long for them to understand how desperate their situation was. They were hundreds of kilometers from land. They had only 10 days of drinking water and a very small amount of food. Their supplies included a small sack of onions, a tin of biscuits, half a kilo of sugar, and a few oranges and lemons. For 6 people stranded in the middle of the ocean, it was dangerously insufficient. They had no maps, no compass, no navigational instruments. Worse still, no one knew they were missing. There would be no search operation. They were not on a major shipping route, meaning the chances of being spotted by a passing vessel were slim. The raft was dangerously overloaded and constantly at risk of capsizing. And circling beneath them were sharks. Linda finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "Are we going to die?" she asked her husband. "Or do we have a chance?" Douglas did not know the answer. But what he did know is this: panic would kill them faster than hunger. The family gathered and made 3 promises to one another. First, no matter how desperate things became, they would not turn on each other. If it ever came to that, they swore they would die with dignity. Second, they would constantly scan the horizon for rescue. And third, they would not give up until they reached land. Before nightfall, they began organizing the raft. Supplies were counted. Duties were assigned. They created shifts for rowing, rest periods, and emergency procedures in case of storms. Everyone understood their responsibility. A single mistake could mean death. They were no longer travelers. They were survivors. And survival required discipline. We may not be stranded in the Pacific today, but in many ways, the conditions are not so different. Resources are limited. Time is short. Expectations are high. Competition circles like sharks beneath the surface. Just like the Robertsons, success or survival often depends on clarity, structure, unity, and the refusal to surrender when circumstances turn against you. Because whether in the middle of an ocean or in the middle of a crisis, the principle remains the same. Panic sinks you. Discipline keeps you afloat. And resilience is sometimes the only compass you have. The length of time the human body can survive depends on a hierarchy of basic needs. Without air, survival is measured in minutes. Without adequate temperature regulation, in hours. Without water, in days. Without food, in weeks. This sequence makes one fact unmistakably clear: not all needs are equal. In that regard, the Robertson family was fortunate. They were on the surface of the water, which meant unlimited access to air. And, because they had sunk in a tropical region, the sea temperature was warm. They did not face the immediate cold shock response, involuntary gasping, or rapid hypothermia common in colder waters. The first 2 survival variables, air and temperature, were, for the moment, under control. Now came the harder part: water and food. Rather than attempting to reach land immediately, they prioritized securing drinking water. Their plan was to sail approximately 600 kilometers north toward what sailors call the doldrums, a region where the northern and southern trade winds collide. This equatorial belt is known for its calm seas and minimal surface winds. Crossing it can be painfully slow, which is precisely why mariners gave it that name. But for the Robertsons, those very conditions made it attractive. Minimal surface winds meant fewer waves. Fewer waves meant a more stable raft. And stability meant survival. They also knew, from their earlier passage toward the Galapagos, that rainfall occurred in this region. Rain meant fresh water. Equally important, this route intersected major shipping lanes connecting the Americas with Australia and New Zealand. Moving into that corridor would increase their probability of being spotted. It was not a random drift. It was a calculated repositioning. Using wind and current to their advantage, they began making their way north. But navigating hundreds of kilometers across open ocean in a damaged life raft is not a controlled operation. It is a test of endurance. And life aboard the raft was brutal. Almost immediately after launching it, they discovered that the raft's hull had been punctured. The tear gradually widened, allowing seawater to seep inside continuously. The more the raft deteriorated, the lower their chances of survival. Within hours, water inside the raft rose to their chests. Their skin developed saltwater sores. Prolonged exposure began stripping away body heat. Sleep was nearly impossible. Whenever they closed their eyes, their heads would slump forward into the water, jolting them awake. Linda feared most for the twins. She worried they might slip silently into the water while asleep and drown. There was only one relatively dry position inside the raft. They took turns sitting there for 1 hour at a time. No one complained. There was no energy for it. By the morning of the 6th day, exhausted and dehydrated, they saw something in the distance, several kilometers away. A container ship. After days of isolation, it was the first sign of civilization. Hope, fragile and sudden, rose with it. Despite firing their signal flares, the ship never saw them. It continued on its course. The disappointment was crushing. They now had only 4 days of fresh water left, and their food supply was nearly exhausted. Later that same day, something unexpected happened. A sea turtle leapt onto the raft. Twice they tried to catch and eat one. Twice, the turtles escaped. By the following day, they had entered their second week at sea. Hunger was beginning to hollow them out. When a third turtle appeared, Douglas was determined not to let it slip away. He secured it with a rope and killed it carefully, making sure its blood did not spill into the ocean and attract sharks. Soon after, they began eating flying fish that landed inside the boat at night. But turtles became the foundation of their survival. There is, however, a physiological reality to starvation. When you are severely dehydrated, your body does not primarily need protein. Protein metabolism produces nitrogenous waste, ammonia and urea, and these must be diluted and excreted with water. Without adequate hydration, excessive protein intake can actually accelerate toxicity. Fat and sugar function differently. Beneath a turtle's shell lies a thick layer of fat, a dense, metabolically efficient energy source. The turtles did not just provide meat. They provided essential fat and, by drinking the turtle's blood, a crude but critical source of fluid. They even used the fat to soothe skin damaged by relentless sun exposure. After 12 days, they reached the doldrums and waited for rain. 3 days passed. Nothing. Fresh water was becoming an urgent problem. The tropical heat that had initially protected them from hypothermia was now working against them. Under constant sun exposure, fluid loss accelerated. Weakness deepened. For most of them, urination occurred only once during that period. The urine was as dark as tar, a clear sign of severe dehydration. Linda, who was a trained nurse, proposed an extreme measure, administering seawater-contaminated fluid rectally, a survival technique sometimes used in desperate conditions to allow limited water absorption through the intestinal lining. The liquid pooled at the bottom of the raft was a mixture of turtle blood, rainwater residue, and seawater, too contaminated to drink safely. Everyone agreed to try the procedure. Everyone except Robin. Using a small hose from the raft, each of them improvised. It was dangerous, but it was preferable to dying. On the 4th day in the doldrums, rain finally came. They drank heavily. But soon, even rain became a threat. Through the night, they took shifts bailing water as it poured into the raft. Exhaustion pushed them to collapse. After 16 days, the life raft had deteriorated beyond reliability. They transferred into the small 3-meter dinghy, sturdier, but far more cramped. Movement was restricted, but at least they were no longer sitting constantly in chest-deep water. The next 5 days brought renewed dehydration. They caught dorado fish, sucking moisture from the eyes and along the spinal cavity to extract trace amounts of fresh water. Later, they captured a 1.5-meter shark and consumed it. The caloric surge briefly restored their strength. On the 23rd day, violent rainstorms struck. Several times the boat nearly capsized. One wave completely submerged it. They were soaked. What few belongings remained were washed away. By the end of the third week, their clothing had disintegrated under salt and sun. Nearly naked, burned, hair matted together, they looked less like sailors and more like castaways from another age. On day 30, they sighted Polaris, the North Star. They had crossed back into the northern hemisphere. That meant progress. By the fifth week, still no rescue had appeared on the horizon. But they were nearing the approaches to the Panama Canal, a heavily trafficked maritime corridor. The statistical probability of detection was increasing. On July 23, 1972, the 38th day, a ship appeared on the horizon. They fired their last remaining flare and waited. The vessel was a Japanese fishing boat named Tokamaru, en route to the Panama Canal. At first, the fishermen suspected pirates. A drifting raft in the middle of the Pacific was not an ordinary sight. Then someone aboard noticed a woman with 2 children. As they drew closer, it became clear these were not attackers. They were survivors. As the ship approached, tension dissolved into overwhelming relief. One by one, the fishermen lifted them onto the deck. Exhausted, emaciated, dehydrated, but alive. Their tongues were so swollen from dehydration they could barely speak. Despite extreme hunger, food was not given immediately. Refeeding had to be gradual to prevent shock to their digestive systems. In an irony that could not be ignored, Douglas found himself releasing a resentment he had carried for decades. In 1942, during the war in the Pacific, he had lost his first wife and son in a Japanese attack. Now, decades later, Japanese sailors had saved his second family. History had come full circle. 5 days later, when they arrived in Panama, international media were waiting. The British embassy intervened, arranging accommodations at a hotel. Robin returned to England by airplane. The Robertson family sailed home by ship. Their daughter, Anne, was waiting for them there. The family was reunited. What ultimately brought them home was not luck alone, but discipline, ingenuity, unity, and an uncompromising will to survive. It was an experience none of them would ever forget. The small dinghy that carried them through the worst days, Edna May, is now exhibited at the National Maritime Museum Cornwall. Some of the teeth from the 1.5-meter mako shark they caught and ate were preserved as mementos. Thank you for listening to this story. If you would like to see more stories like this, following and supporting the channel truly makes a difference. Until next time, take care.